Now let's take a look at factor by grouping. When we go to factor, we're going to count how many terms are in the polynomial so we can decide which method we want to use. So when there's 4 terms, we're going to look to use factor by grouping. For us, what they're going to give us the factors, either going to have 2, 3, or 4 terms. So we're going to look for factor by grouping on the ones with 4 terms. What we're going to do is we're going to split them in half. First 2 terms, second 2 terms. We're going to factor out the GCF for the first 2 terms, and then we're going to factor out the GCF for the second 2 terms. Once we do that, we can factor out the common parentheses, because when we factor out the first 2 terms and the second 2 terms, when we did our example for factoring out the GCF and we had that parentheses that was in common, this is what we should have something that looks like. Okay, we should get something that looks like the x with the parentheses y squared plus 1 minus 3 with the parentheses y squared plus 1 close parentheses. This is what we should have something that looks like, or it should look like this once we factor out the common factor for the first 2 terms and the common factor for the second 2 terms. Then we'll be able to pull out that common parentheses and use the second parentheses to leave what's behind. Remember, write the stuff down and then come back. Pause the video so you can write everything down and then come back. Pause in the video as I'm talking so that you can write down extra information. So for our first example, it says factor the polynomial by grouping. Let's write down that example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this into 2. Notice all I did was first 2, second 2. Now if we get down to where we're factoring out and we don't have that common piece, we can rearrange things, but just off the top, we're just going to split it. For the first 2, there's a 6 that's in common, and the 6x and the negative 42. So I'm going to end up pulling out a 6. And then I'm going to use my parentheses to figure out what I'm leaving behind. So that means I'm dividing each piece by the 6. 6x over 6 divided by 6 is just going to give me the x. And I'm going to copy down that sign because I'm pulling out or factoring out a positive, so my signs stay the same in the parentheses. 42 over 6 is a 7. Now I'm going to go to the second 2. The sign that was in front of that third term, I just copied down. Oh, I wrote the problem incorrectly. I left off the y. Please go back and fix your problem. That problem should have said 6x minus 42 plus xy minus 7y. So now when I look at the second 2, there's a y that's in common. So the y is going to be what I'm going to pull out. And what I'm going to leave behind is an x and a minus 7. From here I find my matching parentheses. My matching parentheses is a x minus 7. And what I'm going to leave behind is a 6 plus y. That's our factor by grouping. Let's do another example. So I'm going to split these in 2. From the first 2, I'm going to find my common factor. It's going to be a 4x. So that's what I'm going to write out front. When I divide those first 2 terms by the 4x, so I can figure out what I'm leaving behind in parentheses, I'm going to end up leaving behind an x and a 2y, a negative 2y. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the next 2. Find my common factor. It's going to be a 3x. I'm sorry, it's not going to be a 3x, it's just going to be a 3. And remember we said that whenever that first term has a negative, we're going to take it with us. So that my common factor that I'm pulling out is going to be a negative 3. Signs are going to swap in the parentheses. Up front I had a negative, now I'm going to have a positive. In the back I had a positive, now I'm going to have a negative. Because a negative divided by a negative is going to give me a positive, and a positive divided by a negative is going to give me a negative. The 3x over 3 is just going to leave me with an x. The 6y over 3 is going to leave me with a 2y. Now I find my matching parentheses. I write that matching parentheses down one time, and then I write down what I have left behind. Notice I drew my arrow with this negative coming down out front, because if I get to the happy where I'm not writing the part in blue, this negative is going to come down with it, and I'm factoring out that negative 3. When I factor out that negative 3, this will give me this x, and this will divide into that 6y to give me this minus 2y. The third time is a negative. When you go to factor for that second set, you're going to pull out a negative. Let's do one more. I'm going to split them in twos. When I split them in twos, first two terms, the 2x squared plus 6x, has a 2x that's in common, so that's what I'm going to factor out. What I'm going to end up leaving behind when I factor the 2x from the 2x squared plus 6x, I'm going to end up leaving an x and a plus 3. On the second two terms, the x and the plus 3, there's nothing there that I see in common. When I don't see anything in common that I can pull out, the only thing that you see is a 1. That 1 can be a factor, or I should say that 1 is a factor. Now we tend to say that that's prime, but when we're factoring by grouping, if that's all you can pull out, that's what you're going to have. So I'm pulling out a positive 1, which means I'm not changing anything. So once I acknowledge that the x plus 3, nothing's in common other than 1, we call that prime. I'm going to write that plus 1 there. If that was a minus, I would have a minus 1 there. Because remember, whatever this third sign is, that's what you're going to see here in between them. My match in parentheses is now an x plus 3. And what I'm leaving behind is a 2x plus 1. So up top, I did have a note about prime. Only factor is 1 in itself. It means you had nothing that you could do or take out. But when we're doing the factor by grouping, when we recognize that there's nothing to pull out, we represent it by pulling out a 1. Because I'm going to have something there to leave in its spot on where that piece was. That's your factor by grouping.